Cal Walker had been born and raised on the same land his grandfather had tilled, and his father had worked with sweat in every season. The house was old, but strong, filled with the smell of cedar, motor oil, and coffee, a scent that grounded him. His farm sat on 40 acres of rugged pastureland, land that had been in his family for generations. It wasn't perfect, but it was home, and it was real. Then came the letter. The envelope wasn't much to look at, just a plain white piece of paper, but the words inside were enough to knock the breath out of him. $10,000, a fine for his fence. It wasn't even a fancy fence, just a simple line of posts and wire, reinforced with field mesh to keep his cattle from wandering. It was a kind his father would have approved of, the kind his grandfather had built with his own hands. A practical solution to a simple problem, keeping two steers from turning his neighbor's prize pansies into a light salad. But that fence, his fence, had become an issue. The president of the Sagebrush Meadows HOA had decided it didn't fit with the visual tranquility of the neighborhood. Cal had built the fence legally, with all the proper permits. He had even double-checked the setback requirements to ensure everything was in line with the county codes. Still, it wasn't good enough. Cal stood by the mailbox, the letter in his hand, the world feeling smaller with every passing second. He stared across his land, the sprawling hills that had once been enough to calm his soul now feeling oppressive. A tightness settled in his chest, a calm sort of anger that only came when someone tried to push him around. He wasn't the type to be intimidated easily, but this felt different. This wasn't just about a fence, it was about something deeper. As he crumpled the letter in his hand, he heard the familiar sound of a pickup truck pulling up across the green belt. It was Grant Mercer, his neighbor from 2 houses over, leaning out of the window with a sympathetic smile. "Looks like you got one of Serena's love notes," Grant called out. Grant had always been the friendly, laid-back type, the kind who never hesitated to help a neighbor. Cal's eyes narrowed as he waved back, a wry smile on his face. The two men chatted briefly about how ridiculous the whole thing was. Grant, ever the optimist, told him not to let the board push him around. But even as he spoke, Cal couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be more than just a minor inconvenience. That evening, Cal did the reasonable thing. He left a voicemail at the HOA office and followed up with a polite but firm email. He included the permit number, the county code, and a photo of the property line to back up his position. The response came 3 days later, a single sentence that chilled him to the bone. "Your fence does not align with our community's aesthetic values. Please remove it by Friday or face penalties." It was a bureaucratic slap in the face. He had followed the rules, yet here they were, telling him that the way he lived was somehow wrong. The idea that something as simple as a fence could be considered offensive, it didn't sit right with him. But Cal wasn't going to back down. Not now. Friday came, and he ignored the deadline. He didn't tear down his fence. He let it stand as it was, doing exactly what it was meant to do, keeping his cattle in and the neighborhood's flowers out. On Monday, the certified letter arrived. Along with the fine came the unmistakable feeling of being treated like a criminal for protecting what was his. Cal stared at the letter in disbelief, feeling the anger rise again. The fine didn't just represent money. It was an attack on his pride, his work, his way of life. He knew right then that this wasn't going to be settled with an apology or polite email. This fight was just beginning. Cal wasn't the kind of man to take things lying down. So he did what any reasonable person would do. He asked for a hearing. He pressed his clothes with the back of his hand, pulling on a shirt that was as simple and functional as a fence itself. He wasn't going to show up in a suit, trying to look like someone else. He was a farmer, and his presence in that meeting would speak for itself. The HOA office was a sterile place, lit harshly by fluorescent lights and smelling faintly of dry erase markers and lemon cleaner. When Cal walked in, he felt out of place, like an old dog in a house that didn't belong to him. At the head of a plastic conference table sat Serena Vale, the HOA president, her expression tight behind the smile that never reached her eyes. She was dressed in a pastel cardigan, a bell in her hand that she would use to keep everyone in line. She looked like a realtor who already knew how the story was going to end. Cal wasn't there to argue about right or wrong. He was there to present facts. He laid out all the documents, the county permits, the legal codes, the photos of the property line. He watched as the board flipped through the pages with little more than a half-hearted nod, their attention clearly elsewhere. One member looked somewhat thoughtful, but that was about it. The vote was a foregone conclusion. When Serena Vale spoke, her voice was cold, dismissive. "It's not about legality, Mr. Walker," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's about community standards." It wasn't about the law. Then, it was about fitting in. It was about making sure everyone's property looked the same, followed the same rules, whether those rules made sense or not. One by one, hands shot up in favor of removing the fence, as if they were voting on something as trivial as a lawn decoration. Only one hand stayed down, Noah Tran, the thoughtful member, who gave a small nod in Cal's direction. But his vote wasn't enough to sway the outcome. The fine stood. Cal left the meeting feeling like he'd just been part of a show, a performance where the ending had been decided before the curtain even opened. Serena rang her bell, as if she had won something important. The door slammed behind him, and the weight of the situation settled in. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about something deeper, about a group of people thinking they had the right to dictate how everyone else should live. He drove home that evening, the quiet inside the truck thick and uncomfortable. The kind of silence that settles in when you realize you've been underestimated, and when you're no longer willing to let it slide. Cal's thoughts churned. The fine? That wasn't the point. The point was what the fence had come to represent, an invasion of his rights, his privacy, and his way of life. When he pulled into his driveway, he took a deep breath. The fence was still standing, silent and defiant in the moonlight. It was a reminder that the rules weren't always right. Sometimes they were just rules. And sometimes a man had to stand up and say enough was enough. The weight of the HOA's decision pressed down on Cal like a stone in his chest. He was a man of patience, but there was only so much a person could take before something inside them snapped. The fence wasn't the real issue, and by now he knew that. The fine wasn't about money. It was about power. It was about the HOA's desire to control what they couldn't see, couldn't touch, his way of life. But Cal wasn't about to let them win by playing their game. He needed a statement, a way to show them what real power looked like, something more than paperwork, something that didn't fit into their neat little world of rules and regulations. That's when he thought of Colt, his cousin in Montana, a man who lived on the fringe of society, running a bison preserve. Colt was as wild as the land he worked, a man who believed in the untamed spirit of the West, just like Cal did, in his own way. "I've had enough of these people," Cal muttered to himself one morning as he sat on the porch, staring out at his land. "Time to make a point." With a grunt, he picked up the phone and called Colt. After a few moments of conversation, Colt's laughter echoed over the line. It wasn't the laugh of a man who found something funny, but of someone who understood exactly what Cal was planning. "You want some buffalo, little cousin?" Colt asked, the amusement still in his voice. "I'll send you the 3 sweetest giants we've got. They're like 2,000-pound house cats, until they're not." Cal smiled, the first real smile he'd had in weeks. He didn't need to ask Colt twice. The plan was set in motion. For the next 3 weeks, Cal lived 2 lives. By day, he worked on the farm, fixing tractors, mending fences, and taking care of the cattle. By night, he buried himself in livestock regulations and fencing guidelines, making sure every I was dotted, every T crossed. The research was grueling, and his eyes burned from hours spent studying, but Cal didn't care. This wasn't about a fence anymore. This was about showing the HOA what it meant to mess with the wrong person. He made a trip to the Agricultural Extension Office, where he met a man named George who had been around long enough to know the ins and outs of every regulation in the book. George looked at Cal's plans, nodding as he inspected the drawings, the pasture plans, and the feed schedules. He stamped the form with a grin. "As long as they're on your ground, contained and cared for, your HOA can't do a thing but look over the hedge and grumble," George said with a wink. That was the moment Cal knew he had all the legal backing he needed. Now, it was time to reinforce the gates, install extra bolts, and set up the solar-powered alarms that would alert him if anything, even a dragonfly, touched the wires. He ordered the feed, set up the waterers, and posted professional signs that clearly marked the boundaries. And then, on a clear morning with a kind of crispness that hinted at a storm, the trailer pulled into his driveway. The ramp lowered, and out stepped the first bison, followed by 2 cows. The massive bull, whose head seemed to block out the horizon, was named Atlas. He was everything Cal had imagined, graceful, powerful, and awe-inspiring. When Cal laid a hand on Atlas's rough hide, he felt the old wild hum that seemed to pulse beneath the surface of everything. As the bison settled into their new home, word spread faster than wind. SUVs started showing up across the green belt, cameras in hand. The neighborhood watched as the herd grazed calmly on the land. It wasn't long before Serena and 2 other HOA board members pulled up, as if they had come to inspect the damage. Serena, wearing her ever-present tracksuit and oversized sunglasses, stepped out of her vehicle and stared at the bison like there was some sort of mistake. "What exactly is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her tone syrupy sweet but sharp beneath the surface. "Livestock," Cal said, his voice calm. "My herd, fully permitted." Serena's smile tightened, but Cal didn't flinch. She might have been in charge of the HOA, but this was his land, and it was his right to do as he pleased. "I'm calling animal control," she said, her voice dripping with authority. "Already did," Cal replied smoothly. "They've got the paperwork. Feel free to call. They love paperwork." Watching the color drain from Serena's face was like watching the tide retreat from the shore. She hadn't expected this. She wasn't prepared for a fight like this. But Cal wasn't done yet. The bison were his statement, his way of saying that he wouldn't be pushed around. If they thought they could control him with a few rules, they were sorely mistaken. Cal wasn't just standing up for a fence. He was standing up for his land, his way of life, and his freedom. For a week, there was silence. The neighborhood settled into an uneasy peace, as if waiting for the storm that had been brewing to finally break. Cal kept to himself, focusing on his work. The bison, particularly Atlas, seemed to bring a sense of calm to the land. People began to drive by slowly, pointing at the majestic animals like they were something out of a storybook. Parents brought their children to watch, and even the local school asked if they could organize a field trip to learn about prairie history. But the peace wouldn't last. As Cal sat on his porch one evening, a familiar truck pulled into the driveway. It was Grant Mercer, his neighbor who had been supportive from the beginning. Grant's face was set, his eyes full of concern. "Just wanted to wish you luck," he said, glancing at the dark clouds gathering in the distance. "Need me to check your west gate before the storm? Make sure everything's tight." Cal hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Appreciate it," he said, his tone sincere. "It means a lot." Grant grinned, his usual friendly smile stretching across his face. "We're in this together." Cal didn't know it at the time, but that moment would come to haunt him. The storm hit shortly after, thick sheets of rain driven sideways by fierce winds. The sky darkened, and the sound of thunder roared across the fields. Inside the gazebo at the park, the HOA's emergency meeting had begun, with Serena giving one of her speeches about the supposed dangers of uncontained wildlife. She spoke of disease, stampedes, and the decline of property values as if 3 bison were capable of destroying everything in their path. When it was time for Cal to speak, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout or demand attention. Instead, he calmly explained the grandfather clause in the covenant, detailing how his land was exempt from the aesthetic rules Serena had imposed. He reminded them that his land had been agricultural long before sagebrush meadows ever existed. The crowd listened, some of them genuinely interested, others looking uncomfortable. In the back, Cal spotted Noah Tran, the board member who had given him a small nod during the meeting. He gave Cal a subtle, approving nod in return. For a brief moment, Cal thought that facts and truth might win this battle. But then, his phone buzzed. It was an alert from the West Gate. Cal's stomach dropped as he opened the feed from the security camera. Atlas and the 2 cows were gathered near the gate, their heads down, their bodies tense. The storm had stirred something in them, and they were pressing against the gate, as if they could sense the chaos in the air. He looked up from the phone screen just as lightning flashed, lighting up the world in a sudden, blinding blue. In that instant, Cal saw something that made his blood run cold. Grant, standing at the back of the crowd, was no longer smiling. He had a look on his face, one that seemed oddly satisfied, as if everything was going according to plan. Before Cal could process it, the storm's full fury hit. The wind howled, The rain pounded, and in the midst of it, the latch on the gate gave way. The bulls were pushing against the weak point in the fence, their massive weight threatening to break free. Cal threw the papers aside and sprinted out of the gazebo, shouting at everyone to get back. By the time he reached the gate, the damage was done. The main latch had broken, but the secondary bolt held strong, groaning under pressure of Atlas's weight. The rain was coming in sheets, and the wind was so strong it felt like it could tear the world apart. Cal threw his shoulder against the gate, trying to hold it back, but the bison were too strong. He could feel the weight of 2,000 pounds pushing against him, the sheer power of the animals testing his resolve. Then a voice broke through the storm. "Push!" It was Noah, his suit jacket soaked through, but his determination clear in his eyes. Another man, someone from the feed store, slammed into the gate beside him, adding his strength to the effort. Cal didn't have to say a word. They dug in together, shoulder to shoulder, until the pressure on the gate eased. Atlas stepped back, the storm calming just enough to allow reason to return to the herd. The patrol cars rolled in, their lights flashing in the darkness. Sheriff Harlan Boone, a man who had seen his share of trouble, stepped out of one of the cars. Serena marched toward him, her finger pointing at Cal like a weapon. "Arrest him," she shouted. "He's a menace. He nearly got people killed." Sheriff Boone didn't blink. His eyes traveled from the gate to the bison, then to Cal, as if piecing together the story in his head. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Son," he said, "you want to tell me what happened?" Cal explained everything. The gate, the storm, the unexpected push from a certain helpful neighbor. Sheriff Boone listened, nodding, and then made a simple suggestion. "Chain the gate for the night, take statements in the morning, and go home and dry off," he said. "But we'll handle this." The next day, Cal knew he had to act fast. He reviewed the security footage, rewinding it to the moment before the meeting. There, in the grainy footage, was Grant, whistling, casual, giving the gate a deliberate jerk, just enough to weaken the latch. Cal didn't hesitate. He made copies of the video, the photos, and all the documents, then took them to Sheriff Boone. The sheriff watched the clip twice, his expression hardening with each pass. "Appreciate you bringing this in, Mr. Walker," he said. "We'll handle it." The next few hours were a whirlwind. Grant, the man who had once been friendly, was arrested. Serena, too, found herself caught in the fallout. The news spread quickly, with the local media covering the story of unlawful tampering and HOA overreach. At the next HOA meeting, there were no bells, no speeches. Just a quiet, somber atmosphere as Noah Tran stood up and made the motions, removal of Serena Vale and Grant Mercer from their positions. Unanimously, the vote passed. For the first time in weeks, Cal felt like he could breathe again. The oppressive weight of the HOA's power had been lifted. His land was his again, and the bison were a symbol of that freedom. In the final chapter, Cal's struggle reaches its emotional climax, and the resolution unfolds. The HOA's attempt to control his life and land ultimately failed, with the support of the community and Sheriff Boone. The truth prevails, and Cal is vindicated. This chapter wraps up the story with a sense of justice and restoration, showing how communities can be built on real connections, not just bylaws and rules. The battle for freedom, both legal and personal, culminates in a hard-won victory,